Welcome, everyone, to the book launch and discussion with Adam Rogers regarding his newly released book, The Post-Atheist 21st Century. I think the best way to start this is with you, Adam. I think a lot of people tuning in and watching and listening along are already familiar with you and your work. But for those of you who aren't, give us a little bit of a bio. Tell me a bit about the life and career of Adam Rogers.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan, and thanks to people for listening and getting the book and checking it out. Yeah, people might know me, in the last few years, I've got some notoriety or whatever, covering the Mass Casualty Commission and doing some videos on legal topics. And so I've been out there being interviewed and such for those reasons. But I go back a little further than that, I guess. I'll go right back to the beginning. Actually, I'm from Guysborough, and that's where I'm living now, and that's where I'm coming to you from tonight. And grew up in, on a dirt road in a rural community, and came from two big families. On one side of my father's side, my grandmother was a school principal, which was unusual. And the 10 children in that family, I think all but one had university degrees and were kind of academics, teachers, many of them. And then on the other side, of my mother's side, my grandfather had a construction company. Many of my uncles and my mother as well, different times worked for the company. So I had that mix of sort of the blue collar, hardworking, building houses kind of side, and also the academics. So came out of that with very fortunate to do so, and grew up playing sports, enjoyed reading, all of those things, and going out in the woods and enjoying nature. So yeah, grew up in Guysborough, and then after high school went off to Acadia, did a business degree there with what would have been a minor in philosophy if they offered minors, but they didn't in the business program, which was fine. From Acadia, I went off to Toronto for a couple of years, worked in the real estate finance world on the Bay Street world for a couple of years, and then came back to Nova Scotia. Well, in the middle of that, I went to South America, did some backpacking, and then came back to Nova Scotia, went to Dalhousie for my law degree, and then graduated there in 2004. Did worked at a big corporate firm, one of the Atlantic corporate firms out of Halifax. It's now called Cox and Palmer, Cox Hansen then, and came back to my home area. Started working for a firm in Port Hawkesbury, and I've been practicing law now for 18 years. So doing that, yeah, and other sides, I'm a fast pitch pitcher. I've been pitching since I was 6 or 7 years old. I've got four Eastern Canadian championships, played at the Nationals and World Championships most years. Actually, even last year, I came out of retirement last year and played in the men's Masters over 40 Nationals and got top pitcher there last year. So lots of things going on. And people may know too, I ran in the federal election in 2015. Didn't win. I'm still practicing law, so I guess I
Yeah.
didn't win that round. But anyway, that's some of the my background.
This is
Uh,
sounding like the life of a very busy man. Now, a lot of people who know you, they may know you as a lawyer, as a legal analyst. You're in the news a lot, and doing the talking head kind of appearances, discussing major issues that affect, that relate to law in Eastern Canada or Canada for that matter. You're known by many locals as an athlete, and as you said there, you're known as a politician as well. But we're here talking about your work as an author and an author of a unique book. So, what parts of Adam Rogers, or what along your way to this point in your life, are you drawing from for your book? Like, where does this come from?
it's funny, in a way, I think I've been writing this book my whole life, and it is sort of one of those sort of opus things, right? You think of big time philosophers, David Hume and Friedrich Nietzsche, and the going back and more modern ones like Richard Rorty or Michael Sandel, and John Rawls. They tend to write their book,
Mhm.
right? So I thought, well, at some point I've got to write my book and get my thoughts down, and this was it. I mean, I took philosophy in my undergrad, loved it, really enjoyed it. Used that, and I consider in part of the book, one of the chapters is talking about a working philosopher, and I try to bring a philosophical approach and my sort of philosophical thinking into my law practice, into my political thinking, all of that. So That's kind of where this came from. Yeah, it's that side of. That's funny, you talk about those areas. Just today, for example, I was in court this afternoon. I got home, grabbed a quick bite to eat, and went up and coached a ball practice for my 10-year-old and his team. Came back, had a Zoom meeting on for politics, and then now I'm here talking about my book. So lots of different facets.
Wow, fascinating. Now, you're a very busy guy. You have your hands in everything. It seems you've actually in terms of your life as a writer, it wasn't that long ago that you published what a lot of people called a book, but was more so like a almost like a long form essay about the work of the Mass Casualty Commission surrounding the Nova Scotia mass casualty here in Nova Scotia. But what led to you writing this book now? Like, is there some reason why you're decided to dedicate your time towards this at this point in your life with everything else you have going on?
It's busy, but there's been a few reasons. And actually, one is because of the pandemic, I had a little more time on my hands. I mean, when the pandemic hit, the courts really shut down in Nova Scotia. And for the first time since I started practicing law, like when you're a lawyer, especially for me, I'm a litigator. And so a lot of the timelines, there's a case that's a year out. You've got cases that are coming up next month. And so there's always something to do. There's always something you can be working on. And so, you have free time and you make that time, but you don't always have it to just sort of play around and write like I wanted to. But when the pandemic came along, that opened up a whole bunch of time for me. So that was good. But the second part of it is the pandemic was sort of the impetus of some of the thinking. Like it was a crisis in a sense, and a worldwide crisis. And I thought it would be a good time to come out with some new thinking. Like I'd heard this from somebody like after 9/11, like people started, it was a weird thing and people started to reevaluate their lives and what's important. And I thought, well, here's this pandemic. It's a shock to everybody, to the society. And it, I think, really had people reevaluating their lives. Like people were thinking, well, I've got more free time on my hands. I'm spending more time with my family. I'm spending more time in nature. I'm enjoying this. For me, I was getting a lot more sleep than I did as a practicing lawyer. And I was like, well, I'm feeling healthier. I'm able to exercise more. So it was different, like people get in their lives, they have the inertia, right? And it's a force in physics, but it's a force in life too. You go somewhere for a couple of years after university, but you just kind of stay there. You establish yourself and you stay there. And it's tough to, even if you want to, shake yourself out of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought the pandemic was really an opportunity in the sense to send out a new message. And that's what I'm trying to convey in this book is a new way of governing, a new way of living, a new way of thinking.
Interesting. One question just came up from the live chat from Granny Linda. She asks how long it took to write the book. Now, you mentioned that you started it, in the earlier days of the pandemic, but I've known you all that time, and you've never mentioned this project to me. So, like, how much
Oh.
time were you spending, and when were you writing this?
Well, it's funny, one of the other reasons I wrote it was like, I have a 10-year-old son. I was like, well, at some point he's going to want to, I'm going to want him to know what I was thinking. And so why not just write it down? And in a sense, I was like, well, I don't know if I need or care if anybody else reads this, that's enough. And so that was enough motivation. But in fact, I started writing it in 2018.
Wow.
And this was pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure if I was actually going to publish it. Right up until I did publish it, I was like, well, I'm enjoying it. I'm working on it. It was like I've enjoyed writing. Like so, you talked about deficits of trust, which I wrote about the Mass Casualty Commission. Actually, I don't know if I've ever said this to anybody publicly either, but I wrote a book, oh, a novel, like 20 years ago. And sent it out to some publishers. Like I've always enjoyed writing. Like as a lawyer, litigator, especially, you're writing briefs. Well, they could be 30, 50 pages, and always enjoyed, I've been a letter writer. I've enjoyed writing.
Mm-hmm.
If I go on a trip, I keep a journal. So I've always sort of enjoyed doing that. And then so I'd started it, I had a bit of a foundation already because I wrote this paper in law school, and the paper was on legal authority since the death of God. Okay. So Nietzsche says God is dead. All right. So it used to be the case. Well, how did you know whether a law was a good law or not? Well, if it agreed with what God said, what the Bible said, then it was good. And if it didn't, it probably wasn't. Well, if God is dead, then what? How do you judge those kinds of things? And so I wrote this academic paper on it back in 2004. So I had held on to it. I always enjoyed that, and I thought it was an interesting. I got a good mark on it, and the professor thought it was nice. So I was like, well, I use that as a bit of a foundation to, you know, go beyond uh, go beyond current sort of governing systems as well, and using the same kind of thought pattern. So some of it goes way, way back, but most of it was written, 2019, and then into 2020 and 21. I really bore down and got to it.
Well, now, we've talked a lot about the book without really getting to what's inside the book. So, with the post-atheist 21st century, give me a bit of an overview of the book's main points and themes. Like, what is the message you've been working on delivering for seemingly your whole life?
Yeah, so this is post-atheist. It talks. I mean, it's about atheism in a sense, but going beyond that, right? So we've had lots of, if you look back through history, you have many societies that are governed by either kings or some ruler that was using a religious foundation to keep the people together.
Mm-hmm.
The Holy Roman Empire, all these things that had religious foundations. Well, at some point, 100 years ago, a few hundred years ago, talking, the French Revolution, American Revolution, and then so on, you would get these countries and governance that was going beyond that and nominally secular, but not exactly, still kind of going along the same path, but still dedicated to one ideology. Well, I think now we're going beyond those ideologies, like a capitalist, a communist, these nation state ideologies, into something that goes beyond that. So you think about places like New Zealand, Iceland, Scotland. You hear about these wellness budgets and wellness governance. Jacinta Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, was probably the most prominent proponent of it. And it was, well, we don't need, just because something adheres to a religious text or an ideology, doesn't mean necessarily it's a good idea. Does it make people's lives better? That's the question. And well, what does that mean? And so it's going into that discussion of beyond ideologies.
Mm-hmm. And you go deep into it.
Yeah, well, it's a new philosophical work. I think I read lots of philosophy. I listen to philosophy podcasts and new books on philosophy, which is a good podcast if people are interested in one. So I thought I think it's genuinely a new work of philosophy, but it's also a bit of a political manifesto. Like, I ran for office in 2015. Every election that comes along, I'm being encouraged to run again. I'm being encouraged to run in the next election. So it's a bit of a political manifesto as well. Like, well, okay, this is how I think governance should work, and I will put it down on paper so everybody sees it.
Wow. Yeah, in that aspect of it, like seeing it as maybe like a sort of political manifesto, that caught me off guard because when I read your writing, I was used in the past your writing, I was used to it being like summaries of legal concepts that are kind of just set in that are very grounded. But this, as you said, is very philosophical. And it just goes in directions I didn't expect to hear Adam Rogers go. I want to ask you about the cover, though. This
Yeah.
this was surprising. Usually, a book like this, I would expect the author's face in a courtroom or something, maybe.
Oh yeah.
This is a very unique design. What is the story with the cover?
So yeah, my face is on the back.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I was like, well, I wanted it to be something that would catch people's attention. And so I was like, well, you saw Deficits of Trust. It was literally just black and white and the title. This is the cover of this. I think it's the only thing I spent any money on as far as publishing the book goes. But I was like, well, that symbol, that is the atheist symbol. Okay. So that's the starting point. The different colors are supposed to represent different ideologies. So you have gold and silver up top. Well, that's the marketplace, finance. You've got the green in the middle, that's the environmental movement. You've got red, well, that's some communist stuff. You've got um, the stars down below, that's American ideologies. And then yeah, so it's all sort of, and it's blended together. So that's the idea, is to sort of, all right, we don't want to just pick one. We want to take what's good from any of them and, you know, adopt that and not be beholden to just one. Let's blend it together. So that's where that came from. Anyway, I
Wow.
hope it'll be eye catching too.
Oh, it certainly is, but it a lot more thought went into the cover than I even expected. I was expecting to say it was a really cool design I happened upon. Absolutely not.
Well, I was like, well, I don't want to steal something, and you know, uh, these books. It's funny, right? On the one hand, I wonder if anybody's going to buy it. Like when I posted it, I was like, well, probably, a couple of my friends will buy it and that'll be it. On the other hand, you just never know, right? When
Mhm.
something's just going to take off and go viral. Well, I had to be kind of prepared for that as well, in a sense, and say, all right, well, if it goes crazy and it gets out there, I better have something that makes sense for a cover and an explanation
Mhm.
in the title.
The cover is striking and gives you a bit of a slap in the face. Once you open it, though, you get right to it. You say pretty much right off the bat that you're not intending the book to be an anti-religion book, but very early on, it's clear that you're taking a critical stance towards religion. For you, how important is it that the atheist perspective, or how important is the atheist perspective to your overall like line of thinking? That's something I've known you for a long time, but that's
Yeah.
something we never got into before.
Yeah, and you know what? It's a weird thing. It's still kind of a risky thing to say
It
publicly
is, eh?
about yourself. Like atheism is growing as a
Mm,
movement. Like if you look at percentages on the, Stats Canada and the United States surveys, it's a growing percentage of the population. But if you, name an atheist politician, like
mm,
there's none. There was a George Clooney movie, 15 years ago about a guy running for president as an atheist, but it doesn't happen. Like you can't think of one that claims to be publicly an
mm,
atheist. So it's important in a way. Like so, one of the big things is I'm talking about in this book, what is our purpose in life? Well, some would say if you're a religious thinking person, well, your purpose is to live a good life so you can get to heaven. Well, okay, take that out of the equation for a moment. Well, that's a big deal.
mm,
So, in a sense, however, and my favorite writer philosopher is Friedrich Nietzsche, and he talks about the herd mentality of religious people, and so it does have some relevance. And if you're thinking about, we'll get into maybe my thoughts on private space and
mm,
private thoughts, and whether there's any moral content to a person's private thoughts. And I say no, there isn't. And a religious person would say, well, yes, there is. Anything you're thinking, God knows that. And if you're thinking the wrong thing, that can make you a bad person. Well, yes, but I don't think so. Okay. So, but on the other hand, and I grew up around, I grew up going to church in a Catholic family, and I enjoyed going to church and listening to a good sermon, and that education and those stories are valuable stories. So on the one hand, the atheism is important. On the other hand, there's no need to be unkind to people that are believers, and it gives them some comfort. And I thought that the book would still be valuable in this sense. Like part of what I talk about is quality of life governing and quality of life living. Well, if you're a religious person or non, you still want a clean environment and water to drink and activities to do while you're living, and uh, when we talk about our digital life worlds and the algorithms and how that all affects us and decision making, well, that applies to everybody. So there's lots of content in there for people who are religious, but maybe I'll convince some people to take another path.
mm-hmm. Maybe this next question will give a sense of the variety of ideas you have in the book. Is yeah, you get into the atheist line of thinking, and and how that may help shape your views, or how that helps shape your views of the world. But you also talk a lot about one of the ideas that comes up several times is the ideas surrounding economic growth maybe not being as important as politicians and our elected officials lead us to believe. That's something that it seems like so much of society's attention is driven towards growing our economy, but it seems like maybe in your book you seem to disagree with that being the all important thing that it seems to be. Talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so you hear this during campaigns all the time. It's like, well, we've got to keep feeding that and grow the economy. It's important. GDP growth should remain at this level. The unemployment rate should be 5% or below, and all these things, these macro numbers. Well, I noticed when I was knocking on doors, and I knocked on at least 5,000 doors, counted them when I was campaigning in 2015. Not once did somebody question the overall GDP growth rate of our country. Like, it's not something that people think about intuitively as part of their lives. So it's like, okay, well, what might that mean? Uh, the other side of it is because so how does economic growth happen? It happens through population growth. Well, there's a book out by Daryl Bricker and John Ibbotson that talks about population growth is going to plateau worldwide. So if that's the case, if the population's not going to continue to just grow indefinitely, then economic growth doesn't seem like it will continue indefinitely either. And we're thinking in terms of decades. So if that doesn't make sense as a long-term goal, doesn't make sense at all. And compare that to decisions that we can make about our own quality of life now, and having live music in your neighborhood, having good friends around that you can count on, feeling safe, and having good health care, these sorts of things that are so much more important than what people really care about. So yeah, economic growth should be subservient to those other more important goals.
Interesting. I apologize if the questions are jumping around because there's a lot you bring up in the book. So to touch on the different concepts that are all so large, I go from one to the other. But one section that really stuck with me, and one idea that stuck with me, was a section about our rapidly changing views on privacy and private spaces. You brought it up just earlier in our talk here tonight, but tell me a bit about this situation that you see playing out regarding our ever-changing views about privacy and what you think is going to happen or may happen in the future.
It came up. It was a weird thing, right? So when people would know, some would know anyway, when I had a bit of a crisis myself. So I talk about a crisis in the book, and I had, we had our worldwide crisis. Well, I had my own sort of personal crisis, which was my law firm went under because of my partner was stealing money from clients, and so that all went through hearings and a whole bunch of stuff. So at one point, I was questioned about whether I had considered a plan to basically cover things up. So everybody had agreed I hadn't done anything to cover anything up, but the fact that there was a thought at one point that I'd considered a plan. Well, it's like, well, so what if I had? I hadn't, but what if I had? Anything that you think privately, like you might think about robbing a bank. You might wonder how you would do it. Go and mentally go through the steps. You might, think about somebody you're not supposed to be in a relationship with, but you'd like to, and you imagine all these things. And so as long as you don't do anything, then there shouldn't, to me, be any moral sanction, or there's no moral content to those private thoughts. All right. So that's one side of it. But the other is with all of this development. So consider these two scenarios. Back in the day, if you looked at the Sears catalog or the Canadian Tire flyer and thought you saw something you liked, well, that was it. There was no impact. Now, if you go online and you're looking at some certain tent on the Mountain Equipment Co-op website, or you're looking at a certain pair of shoes, well, that click is now part of a macro data somewhere that is ensuring that tent, those pair of shoes, that whatever you're looking at is more likely to be produced. And it's going to show up, maybe it's going to show up in your Facebook feed, and it's going to show up somewhere else. So the private spaces that we think are private are changing. So, and the final part of that is these, as we get into AI and more advanced stuff, what is developing are voting algorithms. And so consider this. All right, You buy a book every week, every month. You're part of a book club, you're part of a movie club or something, and or your music stream, right? So your algorithm starts feeding you suggestions, and maybe those suggestions are better than you would make yourself. They're probably better than somebody that would buy you a book would make, because it's based on your own thoughts and feelings. Well, at some point, perhaps we're going to be voting based on those. So if, all right, based on all your activity online, you're more likely, I'm sure an algorithm would say you're more likely to vote for that political party. So maybe at some point you'll just click off and say, yes, I'll vote for that. I'll adopt that algorithm as my vote. Well, all right, then it's a spiraling question of who controls that algorithm. Can it be manipulated to control power? And there's all kinds of questions that evolve from that. And so tackle those in the book too, and try to come out with something comprehensive about it. But it's so our private space, in a sense, to me, should be shrinking, because our private thoughts, these things we express, shouldn't matter, whereas people used to think they do. But all these other things that we used to think maybe were private, our shopping habits and such, and our reading habits, all those things are now have a public element to them.
Mm-hmm. And you described it as a click. Nowadays, it doesn't even need to be a click. It could just be a slight pause. You're
Yeah.
scrolling through the feed and you pause on shoes, and that's enough to tell it, like, "Ooh, I think Adam's
Oh,
he may be
something,
shopping
yeah,
for
something
some."
there caught his eye, didn't it? Yeah.
Yeah,
So show him 10 more of those Far Side cartoons.
yeah, but it's interesting because it's almost like this part of your book and these kind of concepts within the book almost present like a science fiction sort of element to some of it. Like you're mixing so much of, your legal background with these kind of philosophical ideas, looking at the future. There's so much going on, and although it's not a dense book, it's heavy in terms of the ideas and what you've managed to pack into
Right.
it.
It's funny, I when I originally wrote it, it probably could have been 400, 500 pages. I cut it down. It's less than 200, and I cut it down, and like, no, let's just get the good stuff. Keep the good stuff. I don't want this to be like it's not going to be War and Peace or something.
Speaking of getting the good stuff, one of the ideas you present in the book is that the post-atheist thinking is something like thinking as a lawyer, and as you'd be trained to think as a lawyer, and how you would view things as a lawyer. I don't know if you've heard the reputation that many lawyers have in society. Do you think it would be best if we all thought like a lawyer?
What do you mean? We have a reputation?
One of my, I think some of my earliest memories is my dad being like, lawyers run the world. That's sort of idea. Um,
Yeah, there's definitely some of that. So what I mean there, I love going in to talk to like high school classes and stuff, and everybody thinks they want to be a lawyer, right? And
mhm.
so it's like, well, who likes to argue? Well, yes, of course. Or if you're at a party, right? Somebody's got a few drinks. Oh, I could have been a lawyer. All right, great. Well, you like to argue. Okay, good for you. Could you argue the opposite side of that same problem without feeling one way or the other about it?
The
So
emotion.
basically, yeah, like, so you are supposed to recognize emotions, but not be beholden to those emotions. And I do that as a lawyer, and I try to do it as a lawyer. When I'm doing well as a lawyer, that's what I'm doing. But the same as a pitcher, right? So on the mound, all right, there's all kinds of stuff going on around you, and people are rah rah, but you need to be under control to be in the middle of that, and so you don't throw off your teammates or get them, or give the other team an opening. If you see the other pitcher out there and he's getting rattled, well, you've got them, right? So, but thinking like a lawyer is really just about recognizing emotional sides of arguments and trying to keep those to the side. But it's also it's using precedent. All right, what are the best arguments on this point that have been made so far? All right, we'll look at those and adopt them. But if your unique situation that you're dealing with isn't exactly the same as those precedents, well, you're going to evolve the law in some way. And so having the skill to sort of go beyond where the law stands is also, a quality of a good litigator. And yeah, so it's a way to evolve. And it's not law is not a search for truth. There is no truth. There's only what can be proven to be true. So you look to those things and what's the evidence and that sort of stuff. So Uh, if people could think like lawyers that way, but not, you know, but still be people, that would be nice.
Uh, so the book, when I read through it, it seems to be largely divided into two sections. The first section mainly is you providing these ideas in explaining yourself. The second half, it seems to be you're attempting to take all of these ideas and kind of apply them to a lot of society's problems and show how society could maybe tackle some of the problems it has by using the different ideas that you come up with or that you present it in the first half of the book. Talk to us a little bit about, or walk us through, how society's issues as you see them today could maybe be treated under your way of thinking that you present in the book.
Yeah. So I talked a little bit about, the our online future and the algorithms and stuff, but so I'll leave that aside. I mean, that's I think we covered, but other issues like environmental justice and how, all right, if you really take a long-term look at the Earth, all right, what do we have here? We have a planet, and it's the only one we know of. There's definitely other planets out there that can hold life, but we haven't gotten there yet. So shouldn't our goal be one of our goals be to just exist as long as we can?
Mm-hmm.
And like what I try to talk about here, we are part of the universe trying to understand itself. I talk about how, well, maybe I can read a section of the book in a minute just to get the foundation of it, but how, we're evolving along the same lines and we're made of the same stuff as the universe. Well, we have to try to survive on this planet as long as we can. And we've only really been doing that for thousands of years. We got to think in millions and billions. And so if we're trying to protect the environment, we have to think of it on that scale, I argue, and try to justify ourselves to future generations and that we have an ethical relationship with future generations. So I get into that a little bit on the environment, on maybe more controversial topics like medical assistance in death. I mean, all right, it's one thing to kill yourself if you're in your mid 40s and you're healthy and you're just having a bad day or a bad week, but it's a much different thing if you've got 20 days to live and you're just in incurable pain and it's irremediable and all these things that the medical. So when I talk to people about, their estates and planning their wills and doing all these things, nobody in those private meetings has any problem with pulling the plug or those final moments. But because of religion, it's become a big moral issue. Same with drug use. Drug use, has been going back since, like, even in Jesus's time. Like, there was this place outside of Athens where the philosophers went, and it was definitely the case during Jesus's time. This wine they had, it had some psychedelics in it, and so this is where many of the great ideas have come from these psychedelia. We're hearing more now about microdosing and mushrooms and the beneficial effects of cannabis for different PTSD and different things. All right, well, why don't we look at the evidence rather than taking a moralistic view or religious view of, well, drugs are bad. So I talk about that, inequality, international inequality, and how different, taxation schemes might work, and how that integrates with private property. I try to tackle that one, and immigration too. One of the things that's a real thesis of the book is about diversity and diversity of thought. We talk about natural selection, about the Big Bang sent things all over the galaxy, and some of those evolved into stars and planets, and most didn't. They just went into the ether. Well, immigration, that's different ideas, different molecules combining. Well, if you have different peoples from different cultures combining and integrating as citizens, working together, not staying off in their little silos, but actually becoming citizens in the country, well, you're bound to get better ideas, better outcomes, better governance from coming out with the best parts of those diverse ideas.
Uh, just as you're saying that, it reminds me of a section of the book where you describe how fortunate we are here in North America, specifically in Canada, to be able to draw from British and European legal systems, but also from our Indigenous legal cultures. Um,
Yeah.
I would have thought that those different backgrounds and views of the legal system, in histories of legal systems, would have conflicted with each other with each other in some way. You see it as a positive thing. Talk to me about how or why we are fortunate to have these systems to draw from.
So yeah, I mean, colonialism has a bad rap these days, right? And there's lots of it that is bad. But you look at the British legal system, and what it is in its most basic form is precedent cases. And these are long decisions. They're reasoned out arguments over 20 pages, 40 pages, dealing with a point of law. And all right, the next decision looks back at those and it evolves. In Canada, we talk about our constitution being a living tree. So it grows and evolves and changes over time. One of the problems with that system or the British tradition, though, was on the criminal side, which was very confrontational, very sort of fire and brimstone, lock them up, throw them in jail. We see this a lot in the States now. That is, long jail sentences, separating people from society. But on the other side, especially in the Canadian, Aboriginal, Indigenous legal system and tradition, is a reintegration and a knowledge that, all right, that person did something bad, family separated, something happened, there was violent incident. Yes, but they're going to have to come back into the community. And how are we going to do that? How are we going to reintegrate this person? And so, all of our modern restorative justice programs, they've come from that Aboriginal tradition. And so I think the combination of the slowly evolving over time based on logic and reason from the British side, plus the sort of, all right, restorative, reintegrative instincts of the Aboriginal justice system, I think combines really well. Like there's a movement nowadays, and we see Gladue courts and such, and there are people who think that these courts should become separate, and that Aboriginal offenders would go to one court, non-Aboriginal offenders would go to another. I think that integrating the two traditions and for everybody's benefit is the better way to go, and talk about that some in the book.
Wow. I have a few more questions, mainly about the kind of the production and release of the book. But before we get into that, you said you had a section you may want to read to us. I'd love to hear some of it.
All right. Well, I thought I'd read, and this goes into, I guess, it's the section called Introducing Post-Atheist Thinking. So maybe this will explain in a way that was thought out and edited rather than the way that I've just sort of said it off the top of my head here tonight. So I'm going to read a few pages it's from page 15, Introducing Post-Atheist Thinking. So, I have developed what I think is a reasonably comprehensive and modern philosophy that can respond to this moment. I have been able to formulate this by looking to disparate fields of scientific and social study for similar or connected approaches. Modern approaches to governance, along with developments in astrophysics, biology, and consciousness, environmental studies, philosophy of medicine, and the economics of inequality, are all independently reaching similar conclusions that mainstream philosophy, political science, and jurisprudence have yet to adequately recognize. This work is an attempt to connect the various threads and thereby reach some of those conclusions. Rather than a new ideology or structure, I envision us moving away from a reliance on ideologies into an entirely new philosophical model, which I call post-atheist. It is an ideology free of ideology. We had religious states, then secular states with ideologies like capitalism, socialism, Marxism or communism, liberalism or nation-state foundational myths. Our next model will move beyond those structures, indeed beyond structure itself. Signs for how this might look in practice can be found through an analysis of non-sectarian lawmaking. Most modern democracies seem to agree that humans should be responsible for the laws of our societies rather than awaiting some version of divine revelation. So then, where might we find legal authority since the death of God? Who is justified in making laws? Looking at lawmaking and legal authority from this perspective allows the identification of some broad conceptual replacements for God, towards which policies were directed, or rather through which policies were justified. These replacement ideologies would constitute the atheist or secular governance of the past couple of hundred years, based on ideas of capitalism, socialism, local power structures, foundational myths, and other political ideologies. These were each, in their own way, ideological replacements for religion and were meant to reflect nominally atheist structures. In each case, however, they have similar systemic structures to that of religion and thus similar systemic limitations. Examples of some smaller so far state and sub-state governments are now emerging that seek to remove or limit the influence of their own structural framework in favor of more open-ended questions about improving the quality of our lives. These examples represent a new evolution in democratic governance. Similar approaches can be found in our post-atheist physical world. There is an important connection between the open-ended biological science-based view of George Wald and the emerging theories of panpsychism espoused by British philosopher Philip Goff, who claims that all things, whether they be human, animal, plant, or even perhaps inanimate matter such as soil or rocks, have consciousness of varying degrees of complexity. Developments in our understanding of astrophysics complement what we are learning about our biological consciousness in an increasingly unified theory of the universe attempting to know itself. We are made of the same basic building blocks as the particles that have been moving through the universe for billions of years. And through us, those particles are just now reaching the level of organizational complexity needed to reach a meaningful level of self-awareness. Our economic structures and the values underpinning our capitalist system are under scrutiny from all sides, and particularly for their apparent failure to address climate change or stem the exacerbation of global inequality. The end of endless growth is on our horizon, and that alone seems to represent an insurmountable challenge to current structural thinking. And then I go on. So that's a bit there. So what I was trying to do in that section was show, all right, so what I'm talking about in the marketplace, the best, if in a free market, products of all different varieties are developed. Some will be based on how much they're supported in the market, will continue and make it through. Same with natural selection. You know, the Finches and Darwin, all right, some that made sense and evolved in a certain way, well, they continued on, and others that didn't make sense didn't and became extinct. Same as the Big Bang, all right, some chemicals go off in this direction, some become rock planets with no life, some become, Earth that has life. And so all of this wide variety of potential thinking leads to the best outcomes, the best products on the market, the most evolved species, the planets that can hold and sustain life. And to me, that approach, without restrictions, without, you don't want to have market-based restrictions interfering with product development too much. You don't want to have ideologies interfering with the evolution of government and how we're governed. So trying to make those kind of connections.
Fascinating. I want to talk a bit more about the actual physical book itself. So we talked about the cover earlier in the design of it, but you had told me, this going back maybe a month ago, 2 months ago, you had told me you published the book and it was kind of a print on demand idea. I thought that would have meant I go on Amazon, buy it, and 2 months later it shows up at my house. It was literally on my doorstep, fresh off the press, the next morning. Tell me a bit about how you are publishing this, because I don't believe you can go in a store and buy this.
Can't go in a store and buy it. No, not yet. Not yet. We'll see. But so I was really impressed with the process. I used a different source for a different publisher for the Deficits of Trust Mass Casualty book that I did, but Amazon has such a good system. It's a Word document, and you create. Now, the one thing they didn't do quite right, if you get the Kindle version, the e-version, you get a table of contents. So there's chapter titles. There are chapter titles in here,
Hmm.
but the book didn't generate a table of contents as I thought it was going to. So that's an unfortunate part of the written book. But just scroll through and you'll see the contents and some nice anyway, some nice chapter titles too that I worked hard on.
Yeah.
Anyway, no, but it was I was really impressed with how like the book looks good. It's got a nice bound, paperback version. Yeah, I thought that was great. It was really easy to do. Like anybody that's looking at just wants to have a book to give around to the friends or publish. It's a really good like Kindle Direct Publishing was the service that I used.
Yeah, and it looks amazing. It doesn't come across as like a this cheap kind of made to order print on demand thing. Like it feels like a book that you would go into the bookstore and buy. There's no difference.
Yeah, I know. I was really impressed with that, and it was yeah not quite. Yeah, it was better, a lot better than I expected that way. Like yeah, it's and it's simple. It's a good font quality, all of those things. So it's a nice, easy one to read.
Yeah.
And say the Kindle version, if people are more into ebooks, the Kindle version does have the table of contents there, when you can just click on one and go directly to the chapter too.
And I guess it could kind of stand up on its own that way too. Like each chapter, although it does form one narrative that builds up to actually applying the ideas you present to current problems and whatnot. But each kind of chapter does kind of stand on its own as an essay. It's one of those books that you could sit and read it cover to cover, but you can also just pick it up and choose a chapter and jump in.
Yeah, like and it's funny. I mean, that's the way I kind of wrote it too, and I did
Yeah.
this with Deficits of Trust and my other books, any other writing. Like I'll just write, and I'll write a few pages of an idea, and then it'll sort of sit there in a folder or in a pile, and then I just sort of spread things out on a table, and I'm like, okay, that, then that. Like I do this when I'm writing a brief as well. Like all right, I need a case on this idea, on that idea, and then all right, you try to make it flow and connect through. And I'm not sure how other people write, but that's my method.
Yeah. I just opened up the book and I happened upon a chapter that I wanted to ask you about. The chapter's titled "Your Life as an Art Project." I really like the ideas you present in this chapter. Talk a little bit about why you think we should view our lives as an art project.
Well, it connects a little bit with the private space issue that we talked
Hmm.
about before, because what I say is, all right, so what is it about our lives that means anything? And what is it? What means something? Or what is our life? And to me, our life is an example that we provide to others. Okay. Well, you can only provide that example if somebody sees it. So, what about your life is visible? When you go out in the community, yes, you're visible. You're visible to your family. That's an audience that matters. You're visible based on what you do online. Everything that you do that's visible is part of your project. But it's not a scientific study where we can tell, the degree of tension in an iron bar or something like this. It's more like looking at a painting. All right, well, I like that. Or all right, somebody's chosen to be a tradesperson or an engineer, or they've chosen to be whatever, right? Well, maybe that's not what you would do, but you can like, okay, that's not really my style. I don't like the impressionists, or I'm not big into Picasso, but I can certainly tell that that's a good painting. Or yeah, I wouldn't have wanted to be a civil engineer myself. Seems like a lot of work and kind of boring, but all right, I can see that that person has done a good job. And so to me, we're setting that example, but it's an imperfect measurement and it has to be by definition, I think, an imperfect measurement. And so it's just like, all right, you're considering a painting on the wall. Yeah, I like that. You don't have to like the whole thing, but you just, all right, that's a good example. So our lives to me are an example to others that we're providing. And yeah, I thought that was uh, I don't know, a good way to put it, right? So it's an art project. You're working on this, and so the other side of it is, and this came up during my crisis too. And a person has a reputation, and okay, if you want to have a certain reputation, then you need to take part in that and publicize yourself a little bit. You need, like if you want people to know that you were a good parent, well, of course, part of that is you better be a good parent, but you've got to, you can be out in the community and do things with your kids and people will see it. If you want people to know that you handled a crisis well, you've got to handle the crisis well, but then you also have to explain to people sort of what you did, and it takes some courage in a sense to publicize your art project. Anyway, and part of it is as well, I think the best outcomes society wide are only going to be available if people live their lives honestly, like live their true selves. And it's part of the reason I wrote this book, like, and, talk about some of these things. Like, yeah, I've been thinking about these things for 20, 30 years, right? But all right, I don't always talk about it, but somebody's going to get something out of this book. It may inspire somebody else to think a certain way. It may inspire somebody to uh, who knows, change their views. I mean, books have changed my views on things.
Mhm.
So I think if you have to have a little courage to publicize your art project, but that's what ultimately matters about each of our lives.
Wow. That's a perfect segue to my last point here is if people want to be affected by your book, they want to maybe help change the world using the views you put forward, what's the best way to get the book and spread the word about the ideas you present in it?
Yeah, getting the book's really easy. Amazon, you can search my name or Post Atheist 21st Century, Post Atheist anything. It's under the philosophy section, I think, of Amazon. So if you're just regularly in that section, you may just come across it, but that's the easy way to find it. But the best thing people can do if they're trying to publicize it is, I mean, of course, sharing it on social media is great. Actually, leaving reviews on the Amazon site is apparently quite helpful for helping people just naturally land on the page, right? So yeah, it makes it pop up automatically in people's feeds where books that don't get reviews or don't get comments tend not to. So that would be helpful if people enjoy the content or they want to be supportive. That's a great way to do so. Just leave a positive review.
And you also have a link to purchase it in the video description and will be in the podcast description as well for people who listen there. Well, Adam, this has been eye-opening. The book is it's so different than what I expected, but it's so good. It's just another side of you that I didn't even know was there. You present the ideas in a clear way and in an actionable way. I think people who take the time to read it are going to be really appreciative of the work you put into it and thank themselves for taking the time to read it.
Well, Jordan, thank you very much for doing this, and thank you in another sense too. Like I know the section that I read I'm conscious as I was reading it that it had some longer words and all that stuff. I tried when I was writing it, I was thinking of you specifically. I was thinking of other people in my life that I was sort of writing to that audience. And I did the same thing with with the blogs and the stuff in the mass casualty. I'm trying to explain things to regular people, like educated, curious, but not, not academics.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what the book is aimed at. That's the audience. And so I'm glad you liked it, and I hope others do too.
Awesome. And I appreciate you inviting me here to hear another side of the book than what's written in its pages. It's great to talk it out with you. It's great to talk about anything with you, but talking about something as close and personal and as important to you as your new book, The Post-Atheist 21st Century, is my pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Anything we want to get into before we wrap this up? Anything else you want to add?
Well, I think we covered the big points that I wanted to get into in the book itself. We'll see if there's any sort of political future here, whether it's the next election or who knows when. That'll be something I'm going to stand behind. Like this is how I think. If that's what people want in their elected officials, then that's good. I hope that is.
Well, thank you, Adam, and thank you to everyone who's joined us in the chat or who's watching the replay or listening to the podcast version. And bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.